Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Founder and Chief Engagement Officer of Brand Technology, Billy Howard.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for coming out. I know it's early and it's one of the last days, or the last day. So I'm Billy Howard. I am the founder and Chief Engagement Officer of Brand Technology Media. We are a consultancy that looks to harness creativity to solve business problems. And storytelling, transforming it into a business competency as opposed to just a generator of awareness, is really what we are founded upon. I'm also the author of the book E-commerce, which I wrote to look at all of the massive transformational shifts that have taken place since 2008 when the world fell apart. And it's really about creating, collaborating, and succeeding in the new environment. So today, I'm going to walk you through my process of, how do you transform storytelling into a vital business competency? And there's three areas that I'm passionate about that are going to guide our conversation. The first is this idea that culture and commerce must collide and provide you the ear to culture that you need to tell meaningful stories. Too often brands and their leaders, they come up with narratives in a vacuum and they're not listening to the culture that's driving the moment. That's always been important, and in the crazy times that we're in right now, it's probably never been more important. So we're going to look at how do you put an ear to culture to create winning narratives. Then we're also going to look at what is a good story. Everybody in the environment today thinks they're a great storyteller. I'm not so sure I agree with them. But we're going to look at what makes up a great story. And a lot of the trick in doing storytelling well is this idea that you shouldn't really focus on what, you need to focus on the why and the who. So we're going to look at that, particularly around the themes of hope, aspiration, and truth, because those are the things that are most resonant with consumers today. And then the third thing that we're going to look at is how do you transform things that were formerly just seen as activities or utilitarian functions, like collaboration, like purpose, like inclusion, and how do you transform those into strategic drivers of day-to-day business and use them as a pipeline to fuel your storytelling machine. So let's get started. Here we go. So, in looking at the environment that we're in, I think we're in a collaborative purpose economy. And you don't really have to look much further than this conference to see that idea in motion. Everything that we've seen, everything we've heard here over the last few days is about how IBM is collaborating with some of the top leaders and businesses in the world to harness cognitive technology to make the world better in some way. Of course, there's bottom line benefit, but it's also about advancing society and stepping up to activate meaningful change. So if we look at what the definition is and what's going on, which is very important for context and really building thought leadership, we're looking at this idea that we have a new economic engine that, again, is pushing businesses and the leaders who steward them to contribute as much to the world as their own bottom line. Again, much of what we've seen this week. And the other area that's fueling this forward is inclusion. And that's why it needs to move from an activity, saying, oh, well, we had a female entrepreneur meeting for African American women, and there were 4 people in the room. That's not really, you check the box, but it didn't really have any meaning. So we're going to look at what meaningful inclusion looks like and how it should also be a critical component of storytelling as well as marketing and communications. So in order to understand where we're at, we have to understand what the new definition of inclusion is. So just as sustainability and corporate social responsibility have migrated to an overall grander sense of purpose, you have the same thing, diversity moving to an overall sense of inclusion. And you have to understand what that means, which is building collaborative environments in your organizations that, yes, celebrate purpose, but also celebrate the fact that you can get great ideas anywhere in your organization, from rank or geography, it doesn't really matter. Now, this is a process, so I wanted to explain to you step by step how it works. because, people think that telling stories is about picking up a pen and writing it down, and it's a little bit more complex than that if you want to really have it drive towards, a measurable business outcome. So our process begins with an inclusion lens, which must work from the inside out and the outside in to get to the core of what is a meaningful narrative and what should comprise it. Now, if you look at the audience groups in the middle there, you have management, you have community, you have customers, and you have employees. Now, that's not unusual, right? But what is unusual in this model is turning inclusion into a strategy. So you have the disenfranchised around the 4 core groups, and that is how you should begin to get your ideation. So it's reflective of who you are as an organization from the top down and the bottom up. And that leads me to share with you my approach to how you put all this together as a framework that's going to take you to winning narrative and outcome, which is the new inclusion equation. So it's access plus ideas equals purposeful action. So what does that mean? You give everybody a seat at the table to make meaningful decisions and contribute. You take those ideas and you translate them into a part or some component of the overall mission and purpose of the company. Now, purpose is something that is already becoming very, very ubiquitous, and very much like innovation has become over the last 2 decades, or disruption. And when that happens, it unfortunately means nothing. So our process looks at deconstructing what purpose is or should be. This model is built off of the Fortune model, the criteria that they use to come up with what is the most admired company. Well, that's a very similar approach here, where we've deconstructed purpose around the ideas of social profitability, future generation profitability, environmental profitability, engagement profitability, and economic. So if you want to look at brands that are doing this correctly, social responsibility, Unilever, wherever they do business, they've committed to make the world a better place. Future generation, you look at someone like Elon Musk and SpaceX and Tesla, definitely going to ensure in some way that hopefully tomorrow is better than today. You look at environment, you look at a brand like Stella Artois that's committed to ensuring full water supply for future generations. See some of them overlap. And you also look at engagement, how, let's say, Tom's Shoes isn't just about selling shoes, but setting up community outposts as a component of their storytelling to rally people around community and the idea that being good is good for everybody. Economic, we have a brand like Warby Parker, whose entire model is about, well, you buy a pair of eyeglasses, they give an odd pair of eyeglasses to somebody in need, and that's just not to help them see, but that opens up the possibility for people in need to be able to learn and to work. So I think you can get a sense of, these are all strategies that are certainly components of business, but they also serve as the fuel for the storytelling machine, and hopefully will lead you to desired business outcomes. So again, our approach is taking storytelling away from this notion of awareness and meaningless impressions. So what we're trying to do is build narratives from the inside of an organization to prism them to both employees as well as all external audiences. And when you look at it that way, you're really trying to take inclusion plus purpose and create real meaningful brand value. So if you're doing storytelling correctly, you should be able to identify your purpose and create a really solid identity. You should be able to identify new opportunities for revenue and growth. You should be able to build meaningful cultures and attract the right type of talent to defray retention costs and things of that nature. You should be able to turn marketing into an asset that drives future monetization opportunities. The future will be defined, in my opinion, by the marketers who are able to turn the dollar spent not only from a red line item, but maybe to one in black. And of course, this type of model, is fantastic for collaborative opportunities for innovation and growth. And again, each of these buckets drives toward an overall, you have an overarching purpose strategy. What is your company's mission? But these are the different stories, components, and programming that will bring that idea to life. So in order to really understand what's going on, we just set the table on what's defining thought leadership. Now, in order to execute correctly, you really have to understand what's going on with communications and creativity. So, there have been a variety of very subtle paradigm shifts that have happened, but even though they're subtle, they're very, very impactful. So in the past, okay, communications was transactional, it was one-dimensional, it was much about communicating victories around profit. Today, marketing, as we know from everything we've heard, is this conference in particular, is extremely experiential and it's purpose-driven. So if you look at the IBM narrative, it wasn't just about cognitive technology at this conference, it was about all the cool things that they're doing with it to make the world a better place. Girls Who Code, the IBM School Program, etc. Many brands are doing this. Airbnb is another model, that's winning. People don't really understand that Airbnb didn't just reimagine the travel industry. They gave the global traveling community, the right to feel that they belong anywhere, and that's their mission. So, very important to note that shift. So, in the past, we talked about this earlier, it was much about conveying the what. And I believe that the what doesn't really matter as much. Of course, that's the core of the business. I'm not saying it from that sense, but from a storytelling lens, the what is really not that compelling. What is compelling is the who, and creating an emotional connection with what you do. And that's where this idea of aspiration, hope, and truth is fed into the storytelling machine. And an example of that, a really good example is when the New York Times took out an ad during the Oscars to fight for truth. That was very contrarian. And the Super Bowl ads were another example of that. In the past, content and communication was really looked at solely as a driver to push consumers through the funnel. And now, it needs to be looked at as an asset that drives profitability. And that is really what I'm most passionate about right now, is this huge paradigm shift that is pushing brands to migrate from not only being, the emphasis over the last 20 years is everybody needs to be a technology company. Well, I think that everybody over the next 10 years is going to need to become their own media brand. And that's why we're going to talk about executive producing your brand and turning your brand into a studio model, because I think the opportunity for that is huge. You look at people who are doing this right. You have Intel has a content brand called IQ. It's not just about the semiconductor industry, because who would care about that? It's not just about Moore's Law. It's about how do you leverage technology to make tomorrow better than today. You have a similar motto with Boeing. They don't just tell you on their content hub about how airplanes are made. They take a look to examine the future of how we move in the sky. And this is purposeful. This is taking a step forward to provide information, to take purposeful action that's not just going to positively impact their bottom line. It's going to create meaningful engagement. In the past, a lot of the times people chose between physical and digital. Should we do a real-life event? Should we do one digitally? Today, that's really not an option, because in addition to looking to drive engagement, you need to drive storytelling to create meaningful immersion. And the only way that you can drive meaningful immersion is by fusing the two together, so the physical and digital worlds coalesce, so that meaningful experiences can happen that are resonant and again can tie to a direct business outcome. You see that with many brands creating experience stores. Everyone says that the brick and mortar is gone. Well, it's interesting that brands who you wouldn't think have a brick and mortar presence are using those brick and mortar presence to tell meaningful stories. You have Samsung, their retail experience in Manhattan. It has nothing to do with purchasing technology. Their push there is very clear. They say they do not want to take the consumer through the transaction. They want to make the consumer all about interaction with them. And that's a very interesting pivot. And I think it's very, very important to this whole idea of a brand of that size, using this opportunity to connect with consumers and create meaningful experiences that hopefully down the road or throughout a lifetime will result in a positive transaction and business outcome. You have the same thing with the Pepsi Cola House, and they spell it Kola. They're trying to put the spotlight away from soda, and they've created a very high-end sustainable food environment in the middle of the meatpacking district, whose entire menu is a journey of different flavor profiles that are built off of the cola nut. A little bit unusual, but it's a very interesting way of connecting with people that might not have any interest in Pepsi. So, very important to be aware of. So in the past, a lot of how storytelling would work was through traditional media relations. You transactionally came up with what story you wanted to tell, and you pushed it out, and then you hoped that somebody would write about it and do so correctly. And while that's still a fundamental component of any type of brand communications, I believe that there's a bigger opportunity to create stories that deliver aspiration to a world that's looking for hope. So you look at a brand like Red Bull, okay? Red Bull is a very out there brand. They're brilliant. They're one of the first media models along the lines of what I'm talking about. But, they're not just looking at being an energy provider. The Red Bull tagline is something along the lines of making people realize that their potential is limitless. This is why people want to engage with Red Bull. A lot of people engage with Red Bull, including myself, who find the drink not very good. So, it's a very interesting way of creating meaningful connections that matter. Another really good example of that is GE. They created a program called Healthy Imagination because they wanted the world to know that their technology solutions in health were really going to help save lives and shape the future of healthcare. So they created, in their words, not mine, movie sets in different locations. One was in an African clinic, one was in an urban clinic, one was in an ER, and they made these movie sets. They structured them so doctors could share their stories about how they were using GE technologies to make life better for people. That makes it human. That connects on a level that you couldn't do from just thinking about GE, particularly now since they're 99.9% a B2B brand. But a very interesting way for them to pivot and position themselves in culture. So the first two sections we looked at, thought leadership, what's driving it, how do you build the right themes to tell compelling stories. Second section gave you a framework of the landscape that you are communicating within. Now we're going to look at executive producing your brand, which is the process that I came up with to figure out how do you connect all of the dots and make the stories matter. So I came up with this process. I handled corporate communications for many years for Jeffrey Katzenberg and DreamWorks Animation when I was at Weber, and I got to see how a movie studio was run in real time. And it was at the same time that I realized about 7 years ago that brands' greatest opportunity was to become the studios of tomorrow. So we're going to look at the process that, obviously this needs to be customized by client and by situation, but it should give you a really good sense of how to put some of this to work for you relatively easily. So you have the production phase. That's a lot of what we talked about, the upfront work, the development. No different than what happens on the set of a movie lot, People come up with the plot, the script, the cast of characters. That's what needs to happen in the first phase, of development. And then you move on to what is the content strategy, and you move into the production phase, which really looks at what are the right type of content vehicles to build to bring the stories that we've figured out that we want to tell to life, and who are the right people to do that. We figured out ways of doing that both internally, which has become increasingly important to create stories that build living brands that people want to be a part of every day. And equally important is the programming that's pushed externally, so people want to have a meaningful connection with the brand that transcends transaction. Lastly, you're looking at distribution. Again, the distribution strategy, no different than a movie lot or a movie studio. You want to figure out how to sell as many tickets to your show as possible. Because quite frankly, if you do the first two phases well and nobody hears about it, it really doesn't matter. So that's what I was most excited for me personally, to have absorbed from being here this week, is how cognitive technology can inform much of this process, particularly on the distribution side of the house with the Content Hub. I'm really excited to figure out how, it seems to be a perfect solution end to end. So, to wrap up what we discussed, and what I think is most important for you to take away from this discussion, is this idea that we've hit a cultural inflection point, which is moving us away from looking at the singular me in favor of the collective we. And if you take this mind shift and you activate it inside of your company through collaboration and powerful storytelling, you can really create brand assets that harness the storytelling function to drive the true business performance. That's all I have. I don't know if anyone has any questions, but we do have some extra time. If not,